Welcome to the Game Speed Podcast. This podcast is dedicated to expanding your knowledge of what it takes to develop all aspects of elite game speed. Host Jason Fairheller will bring on some of the best in the field of strength and conditioning. If you are looking for new ideas, methods, and tactics for improving sports performance, then this show is for you. Enjoy the show. You probably noticed this is no longer the Speed and Power Podcast. It's now the Game Speed Podcast. And just a quick note before we go into the show notes and our first episode here, as far as why I decided to kind of rebrand and change the name. And pretty much everything I've done as I've taken a deeper dive into speed is truly about game speed development, what I can do to help athletes on the field, on the court, wherever they might be playing. But I just thought it was more appropriate. It might be able to get the word out a little bit better about how we as coaches or athletes can continue to improve our game speed. For our first episode, we brought back a returning guest from the Speed and Power podcast, Ryan Hopkins, one of my favorite coaches to talk to listen to. I just like the way that he thinks about training and looks at training. He really has a really good idea and reason behind everything he does in trying to develop all aspects of speed. And in this podcast, we talk about using weight with jumps, protocols for ascending strength to transfer that over to specific speed development. And that's really interesting. And that's something that I've actually done myself after seeing posts of his and really enjoyed it. We talk about why stutter stepping is not a good option most of the time for athletes, even though a lot of athletes are taught to stutter step when they go into changes of direction. And also whether or not you should keep your toes pointed down or pointed up when doing jumps. Really interesting podcast. He gives great insight into everything that we talk about, and enjoy the show.
All right.
Ryan, welcome to the first episode of the Game Speed Podcast, formerly the Speed and Power Podcast. How's it going?
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Always one of my favorite conversations. So I wanted to have you on first. So let's get right into it. So the first thing I actually want to talk about is you made a post about an ascending strength protocol, and you were just using like single leg version on a hack squat, but you were using, or a leg press, I don't remember which one it was, but going off of like certain percentages and using different ranges of motion for each set. Kind of talk about that and talk about why you think it's important to go from like slightly lower percentages to higher, but as you do that, decrease the range of motion throughout that.
I think, it was kind of something that came to my attention from Al Vermeil, was he had just kind of these ascending squat protocols. And I just kind of looked at it and was like, all right, what's the point of each of these things? And really what he's doing is leveraging the idea that as we go heavier, or we're stronger and more just kind of joint angle extension. So I was like, all right, well, I would like to do that with something that's very just like individual hip and leg focused. So I was like, all right, I have the seated leg press in my community gym. So the first one that I did was just kind of like it's not necessarily like a rhythm squat, but it was just kind of like 6 reps of a lighter full range of motion movement.
Yeah.
And it was to try to get my nervous system and everything on that side really fired up to apply the brakes in reverse in an efficient but very well-timed way. So I was like, all right, I use that as kind of like the primer, but also like just to get everything really like squeezing and reversing well. And then it's like, all right, that's kind of light, but I want to do something now that's explosive and concentric from around those joint angles, maybe a little bit north. So I would put the weight up maybe 15% and then change the angle, maybe like get 15 to 30 degrees and more extended of a position. And then I would just try to punch it. So I would do, 4 to 6 reps of a dead stop. And that to me was like, all right, now this is just purely a propulsive exercise. I was like, all right, well, that's kind of like the turnaround point at the bottom. like when we're going to really produce the highest amount of force and have the highest amount of acceleration. I've worked on purely the acceleration and the propulsive movement, but now I want to do something where it's going to be in, a shorter time window, but also very, very high force for the range of motion. And so that was a really shallow kind of like a rhythm pulse for 10 to 12 reps at the heaviest weight. And that was really just to kind of close the gap of like, if there was any way to make that stuff transfer to like sport movement, it's not going to be at like super deep hip knee flexion. It's going to be
Sure.
more in like that. Yeah, I was trying to keep the reps under, like, I forget what it was. Maybe it was like 400 milliseconds or something, but like some really long ground contact time that you might see in a change of direction at high speed, something like that.
Sure. Is there a reason that you went unilateral versus bilateral doing that? Or was that just kind of how you wanted to go about it?
Uh, I just kind of tend to think that some of the bilateral stuff, like limb to limb, isn't that significant as much as it is like it's a lot of pressure through like everything from the bottom of my rib cage to my pelvic floor and to like the top part of my hamstrings. And I'm not saying that that stuff shouldn't be integrated. I'm just saying that if I'm really working on like more intramuscular coordination effort than anything else, I need to put the emphasis on one limb versus the other to try to get like just the higher amount of recruitment in that limb. You
Yeah.
know, that's kind of the deal. And then I also think for some stuff where you're trying to work on lower body power, that you need to stabilize it. And I think having something like in a barbell or even like a trap bar sometimes is just not as it's not inherently stable as a machine. So that was it's kind of my thing. I think you need more individual leg hip strength, and I think that if you're going to do it well and whatever, you do need to have a little bit of a stability aid in some kind of way.
Yeah. I After you posted, I actually did it for 3 weeks, like once a week. And I felt great. I I tend to, if I go all full range of motion with my lower body stuff, I actually tend to feel slower and I'm slightly slower with my speed stuff.
Yeah,
And I don't know if it's because like it just beats me up a little bit more and I'm 38 years old.
I feel
But
that.
yeah, yeah. But and there's always the argument of like, should you do full range, half range, a sport back squat or whatever. But I do believe that there needs to be full range of motion training at some point.
Right.
And I like that mix of doing that from set to set. And I actually started on those days, I would actually pair that protocol with like a similar sled protocol where I would go heavy weight and just like on dragging a sled,
Yeah,
and I would just do a 3-step burst, and I would do that for like 4 to 6 sets, and then I would go lighter weight, maybe about like 20-25% body weight, and then just do that straight, and then I would go with no weight and do that.
I
And
love that.
yeah, and I was like, I'm using a free lap to time everything, and I was hitting numbers that I was hitting in the summer when I was sprinting a lot more. Now I'm only doing like linear work like once a week or so. But I was like, this is like I felt better now compared to like the times I was getting last year about the same thing. So
You know,
like,
I think
how
it's
can I
like
do?
just about
Yeah,
tuning. Like it, to me, where my brain has gone with a lot of this stuff is, you need muscle tissue, but also have to tune your nervous system to behave the way that you want it. And it kind of goes back to that idea of like complex training, where you are using that like just higher static load or longer time window to produce force to get like to set the background of it. So all right,
yeah,
it's not necessarily perfect sequential activation, but it's a lot. It's like a lot of activity, right? And then you just start to narrow it down into like the time frames that you want to use it. And most of the time, just because of the time, again, it's gonna change the joint angle or the actual like the how deep into flexion that you start, right, or that you feature. But yeah, I mean, look, that there, I did it a couple ways. I did it that way. I did it with the Smith machine, very similar, where I did some stuff that was more like from the top down to the bottom. And then
Yeah.
I also did it for in this just before this kid left for his pro day, a lot of stuff on his his acceleration for his 40-yard dash that was almost exactly like you said. We did uh, relatively heavy starts. It's like 5 steps. It's not really 10 yards, maybe 5 steps.
Yeah.
And then we would do like a 20% body weight for his 20-yard. And then we would open it up and have him do like either like a real easy walk in, but like blast out for his 30s. And it worked really, really well. I mean, it worked so well. I mean, I posted a lot of his stuff because this was the first time in my life that anything ever really went that well, and by the way that we discussed it. So it was like it was almost funny to me, and I felt like I had made more progress in my career with another person, and not just my own experimentation, than really
Yeah.
ever. But it was based on the same thing. It was like just get them really, really fired up as much as you can, and then start to bring it into the proper context of what it is you're trying to do. And this kid ran, he ran a 4.27 from a just a like a 6 feet, so 2 yard walk in start.
Yeah. So he is explosive. He is
Oh,
so fast.
super explosive.
Yeah.
But we had, we did a couple things where it was like 10% body weight sprinting for 30 yards. And then we would take off his chain, just, 20-pound chain, and we would have him do the same thing and then time the flying 10 on the back of it. And he hit 0.88 for two reps in a row. So it was like, wow, this is like he's not a super strong kid pound for pound. He's strong enough. He's more than strong enough. But everything seemed to be like we could just dial him up. And we used a lot of your like side to side drills and just a lot of stuff as general tools to stoke his kind of like twitch rate, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
And it worked really well. So I mean, yeah, just starting to play around with stuff and use the things that I know, and it's going good.
That's awesome. Another thing I wanted to get into was adding weight to jumps. So,
Yeah.
how much weight do you, and I mean, it can kind of go back to what we just talked about, but when you're adding weight to jumps,
Yeah.
how do you choose the weight? Do you go by like, I'm going to see how high they get off the ground? And depending on that, that kind of is going to dictate the load more than even just a percentage body weight or something like that.
So I use both. So like really I'll kind of compare. I'll tell you the truth. I don't jump with more than like 30% body weight
Yeah.
because uh I don't think that it carries over, and I think that you're always going to have to land, right? I don't do a lot of just heavy concentric weighted box jumps. Like I'm not ever having them really land on something. But I'll do both. I'll kind of look at like, okay, if the guy jumps 30 inches and I give him 30% body weight, I try to go no further than like maybe a 30% decrement.
Yeah.
But that's really, I kind of compare and contrast. But really, to be honest, I go with percentages of body weight for a lot of people because I feel like in the range that I choose, it's kind of similar. I don't get to like a tipping point where, oh, okay, well, this guy has unusually high numbers at 30% body weight versus this person. So it's like, from 10 to 30% body weight is the usual range. And I see that, like, look, for simple math, if someone can jump 20 inches with 30% body weight, most of the time they can jump like 17 inches, 16 inches. Right. So that for me is, at least in my experience, has been constant. And that's kind of where I keep it. But yeah, I see a really comparable performance. And to me, that just says, look, power production in that reusable range of motion is a lot higher.
Yeah, I've tended to like over the past couple of years, if I'm going from a dead stop or I won't say super slow eccentric, but a controlled eccentric. then that's when I'm using closer to that like 30%.
Right, exactly.
And then if I'm going something like a drop squat jump where I want them to go down and then back up fast, then yeah, they're probably using most of the time it's like 15-pound dumbbells or something
Exactly.
like that in their hands, where I just want that. Yeah, I need that transition to be fast on that. Whereas the other one, I'm just trying to get out of it as fast as they can. But it does seem to be helpful like that. And you're right about like they have to land it. You know, if I have someone even holding like a kettlebell doing a jump, sometimes the landing isn't as nice as I want it to be. The jump looks pretty good, but then when they gotta like come down, it's not quite as good.
I think you also have to play with like, look, what it is, like you said, what it is on that movement that you're trying to emphasize, right?
Yeah,
So, like for me, again, like if it's power at takeoff, and I really still want comparable displacement, then I'm gonna go pretty light. If it's like the turnaround point at the bottom, I'll give them generally a little heavier. Or if it's just like you said, purely a concentric power movement, I'll go a little bit heavier. But for the most part, that's that I keep it in that range because I feel like it really, it affects all points. Like when the displacement is pretty comparable, when the speed of turnaround is comparable, all those things, it's like that you're doing pretty well with everything that they can have that's usable. I think where we get a little crazy is when like the actual like jump signature and the time that they have to produce that force gets way outside of normal,
yeah,
and you have to land. Obviously you can like trap bar jump and dump it upon impact, but uh that's when I think like maybe the actual like tissue cost for that training cycle is like a little bit more than we really want. It's like I don't
for
know if the
sure.
end justifies the means per se.
You ever use the like some of those squat jump protocols from like super training where people are standing on like a box, each foot is on a box, and they have the kettlebell go lower than the boxes, so you're getting like
Yeah,
super deep.
yeah,
Yeah,
I love those. To
they'll
be
get
honest,
you.
yeah,
Yeah,
those are so that's like what I mean about like that turnaround and the highest amounts of force that you're really going to produce in that jump are going to be at that bottom braking phase. And I like those because I like deep range of motion stuff, right? I think that that's a really valuable point. I think if you're going to train athletes and you want to have a usable amount of strength, that's a really, really good one because that is
yep,
where you actually have time to access strength, but not that much time. You're in a deep flexion
yep,
angle. The point of turnaround is really emphasized. I'll tell you, I don't necessarily do it with everything, but I try to really emphasize like I want the most acceleration and change to happen as early into a range of motion as possible for a lot of those jumps. And we do that, like I'll do it sometimes with light trap bars, like maybe like 66 pounds, like 30 kilos or something like that,
yep,
for like a 180-pound guy. And that's what we look at because that, I think if you're producing your maximal amount of force or your peak power at like 30-40% of your total range of motion, I've seen a really good carryover to that. And I mean, like almost to a person. I don't think that there's not room for improvement with that. I think that you have to pick the right implement. I have played a lot with like, hey, what do I like? Do I like that single kettlebell between the legs, slightly wider than normal base, maybe like outside of your normal jumping position versus
yeah,
the dumbbells in like, the suitcase position that to me looks a lot more like how people jump.
yep. I agree.
So I do both. I
I
mean, really,
tend to go with
does both.
the dumbbells more, but occasionally I do go into those kettlebells. How often would you say you go to a barbell
Oh man. You mean for jumps?
for jumps? Yeah.
Not so. Look, if you asked me last year, maybe not last year, maybe like 2 years ago, I would have said often. because I think the balance of like certain things is whatever. I also think that you have to have really stable technique to time. Like, all right, so if it's a shallow range of motion, you need less technique. If it's like, hey, we're going to do a squat jump with 30 to 40%, it's generally like 30% of your back squat, right? When you start doing that.
Yeah.
So even if you
Not
have
an
a four,
insignificant load.
no, 120 pounds. If you squat 400
Yeah.
pounds, 120 pounds. So to me, I was like, all right, for me, I'm good at this movement and I can do 5 reps in a series and they look pretty like it's going to be a similar jump. For a lot of other people, if you don't have barbell skills like that, you don't. I also am now in this whole, like maybe this will change. Of like, I don't know if I necessarily want a super static posture across all segments quite like that. Like maybe
Yeah.
not biasing extension quite as much as a dumbbell, which may pull me over my rib cage a little more. I'll be slightly more rounded through some of those segments, and as compared to a barbell. But I would say not anymore. 2 years ago, a lot.
Yep. One thing I did, and it was with a group of high school kids a few months ago, was like the Dvorak wave squat
Yeah, yeah.
protocols, but just with an empty barbell where they would go like quarter squat, half squat, full squat, and then into a jump, but no
Jump.
pause in between any reps. And the very first time they did it, they've back squatted before, but moving the bar that fast, it was like they were landing it a little bit slower, but after a couple sets, it was a good way to get them moving fast and increasing their range of motion each time, and then eventually translating that into a jump versus just initially saying, all right, jump for 5 reps with a bar on your back.
That wave squat thing is so like during COVID, I played so heavily around with that whole series. And I really liked it. And then kind of, yeah, that was kind of, I really liked it. And I don't remember what load I ended up using, but it might have been like 40 kilos total or something like that. But I was like, man, this is so brilliant. And it was really, I thought, good for technical reinforcement because it wasn't about the max height of each jump, right? It's really about the turnaround. It's with the
Yeah,
turnaround
the
point.
transition. Yep.
Right. So that to me was like, all right, this is actually a good rate limiter in term because I need like my interaction with the ground and my point of balance at that point to be good. So I can only do it as well as it's like only as heavy as you can do really, really well. And
Yep.
that was nice. And I felt really good. I still use that with people that I have confidence in their skills. But man, yeah, I think for that particular protocol, it's just that's money in the bank.
All right. Love to hear your thoughts on this because, all right, I've heard two really good arguments on each side of toes up or toes down when an
Oh boy.
athlete performs pogo jumps. So, like, I originally would have thought toes, keep your toes up, like dorsiflex, because I want the athlete to anticipate the ground, where, like,
Right.
right before they hit the ground, they're actively putting force into the ground. And that's going to create a co-contraction and that's going to create a little more stiffness once they hit the ground.
Right.
And then you hear Brian McGinty, Power Plus, and he's a like disciple of Marinovich.
Right.
And he talks about keeping the toes pointed down the whole time because he wants, as soon as the toe feels the ground, then to start producing force right after that. What do you think?
Oh man. Oh God. So this is like the $1 million question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer for it, but I'll tell you kind of my where I sit with it on both sides. So I think that I've watched a lot of people. I've watched a lot of really good kids jump, and if I give them even like a traveling forward pogo series, if I say, "Hey, look, ascending height pogos in series for 6 reps," when they're really popping the ground on the last couple reps, those toes are not popping back up, right? And then I think about, all right, am I looking for am I looking for maximal stiffness, or am I looking or like in minimal deformation, or am I looking for the optimal amount of travel, amount of joint range of motion change, all those things. And I kind of think that there's just a sweet spot where it depends, right? It depends on the actual like context. If I'm going for pure stiffness, like if for maximum velocity carryover, I might not want a lot of deformation, and I might want a little bit of rigidity beyond what I would do if I was just doing a pogo hop or something where I'm looking for a lot of just elastic return, right?
Yeah.
So I think that really matters. I'm gonna go like I'm gonna phone it in and use the worst example, but like if you look at like the Maasai tribe guys,
Oh yeah, here we go.
well, they pop up off the ground and they're not flexed up in pre-anticipate. They're not anticipating the ground. They're
No, they
flexing like
aren't. Yeah.
hanging out, right? Like these things are down. So I've tried to pause a video and see like what happens the moment before they get to the floor. Do I see like feet ready? If you've ever looked at people jump and you can see like their shorts are up a little bit and you can see the bottom of their quads and all these things, I'm looking at like, all right, do I see like a little bit extra like activity and stuff start to tighten up? And you do. So you see pre-activation and you see anticipation. You see anticipation of the ground. And so then I don't know. So like I think that the answer is really, if your goal is absolutely short ground contacts under like almost under 100 milliseconds, I think that maybe there is some benefit to being slightly more tense, slightly more stiff, maybe requires slightly more like activity of the lower leg, right? I don't know if it's voluntary or
Yeah.
not. I think if it's maximal displacement for vertical height, especially, that it's probably going to be somewhere in between. So I think you might not see the ankle pull up a whole heck of a lot and reduce all range of motion, but you might see, instead of hanging, you might see it go to there. Maybe not up here, but somewhere like about there, where it's like it's going to give a little, it's going to yield, but ultimately it's going to be well timed rigidity and stiffness. But I don't know if
For
that
sure.
answers that question at all.
Short point. When I went to Africa like 10 years ago or whatever, we visited a Maasai tribe, and they want you, or if you want to, you can go up next to them and they jump and you jump, and you basically just get embarrassed by how little you can jump next to them. It's
Yeah,
it's it's pretty funny. But I think about it this way. And I'll say too, like Brian McGinty has all of his athletes doing it without any shoes on. So he's all about like improving the feel of like the foot when it hits the ground. So I think that that does factor a little bit. But when talking about using the pogos for the purpose of improving top end speed and totally reducing ground contact time, I do like the toes down. When I'm thinking about using it in any form of change of direction work, if someone is just sticking a foot to the side on the ground, their whole foot is hitting the ground. It's not just like you're pointing toes into the ground and then
brilliant.
reacting once the toes hit the ground. So, in terms of like, if I'm having athletes just do them straight up and down or just go forward, then I don't keep your toes up. But if I'm doing any like side to side multi-directional pogo jumps, then I do want them to think about anticipating the ground a little bit, particularly if we're starting to get into further like horizontal contacts of side to side, something along those lines.
Dude, it's so crazy you say that. So like again, I don't know, it would just default to what I've been doing most recently. The guy that I'm working with is a cornerback, and we're doing a lot of stuff with like just like punching laterally, punching 45 degrees forward and back. My big thing was I didn't want to see a little footprint. I told him like I don't want to see a little toe into the ground. I want to see like a wedged out foot. I should be able to watch it, right? And that was my thing with him, was not getting stuck on that kind of like drop, and I want to see it go like dig and pop.
Yep.
And that goes perfect with exactly what you're saying, is I want to see a little bit of that like pre-activation and dorsiflexion. It's super interesting. Because that was my observation with him was like, look, we need this is again, like, I don't know if this really works or not, but we were looking at like, all right, where's our pop foot into the ground? Let's look at the actual contact. It was raining basically the whole time this kid was down, so we had like soft ground to work on, which isn't going to give you a good pop anyway. But
Yeah,
we would look at like what that foot looked like, and then how far away the other one was on some of these things, and what, like, yeah, exactly, what were you actually traveling, were you staying in your angles and whatever. And that was kind of the deal, was is you can't soften as much as the ground will allow you to for some of these things. And that was yeah, that was kind of the big takeaway for him, was to pop the ground the right amount. And we would look at his footprint, because that was, you know, that was a good indicator of whether or not he was actually doing a good interaction with the ground.
for sure. Something else I wanted to ask you about was you had used your free lap to time curve running. And
Yeah,
because of the space I have, I don't time as much curve running. And I don't have like the distance to really get somebody up to speed.
yeah.
Um, so I guess like what are some of the things you noticed as far as I guess how much of an angle did you have them perform? How much of a speed decrement was that compared to if they ran that same distance straight ahead? Those
Yeah.
kind of things.
So it was. So I'll tell you, I did much more with like very shallow cuts more than curved running, but I did do some curved running. It's really hard to say exactly what the decrement was for the curve, because that was only like 7 yards, 6 yards. So it was like a
Yeah.
three yards between each cone. Uh, on the cuts, if someone would say was running like a 1.6 or something like
Hmm.
that for a 10 yard acceleration, it was no more, if they were very efficient, than like a 1.7 to a 1.75. So it was,
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
yeah, really good. So the only other thing I'd say as a caveat is that I was giving everybody about a 2 yard, about a, like, I just walk 6 foot lengths, 2 yard of a buffer, to make sure that like the timing was good. So it wasn't like there wasn't a little bit of speed going into it.
But you have to with that system a little bit. You don't want it to
Yes.
be like you start moving and it picks up too soon and you're like, all right, this is too slow. I know this wasn't what they actually did.
It's exactly right. No, I just gave them a normal buffer to where I knew, I think it's like 80 centimeters or whatever it is for the free lap, that they weren't going to trip it early, but it was going to be like, we were holding them. Like, if I'm giving you this much, that's all you're taking. Cause I don't, again,
Yeah.
it's the same thing. I want times I can base a decision off of. So that was what I saw, is if someone was really good and there wasn't a lot of rounding out, and they could really like punch their foot into the ground
Yeah.
and get off of those 2 steps as they go around the curve, then it was really close, like a tenth of a second, maybe slightly more than that. Uh, the curved running, to be honest, I don't think I've ever done it really more than 7 yards. So I don't really know, but I would say like with my angled stuff, I thought
Yeah.
that was a really good blend of like, are they being efficient and are actually accelerating out of their cut, as opposed to chopping their feet and like and decelerating, really.
Yeah. I wish I would have timed it. I have a kid now and he's a top 50 lacrosse recruit in the country for high school and tore his ACL 2 years ago and I guess 2 falls ago playing football. And now like he's coming back and he played lacrosse last year, but his dad had sent me video of him and his like highlight video, he doesn't stutter step at all and he's super explosive. And when I
Yeah.
started working with him this winter, every single cut he would make would be like 10 stutter steps and then go. Even though like said he felt fine and didn't have any limitations,
Yeah.
but now he's finally at the point where I can do reactive drills with him and he doesn't do that anymore. But I wish I would have recorded just to demonstrate how much slower that like stutter stepping is
Yeah.
versus planning 1 foot into the ground and going, especially over short distances like that.
It's a big like gripe I have about, I work, so since we've last talked, maybe even before that, I started working for a different high school where it's one of these like super schools. So it's South Florida. We have a transfer portal. We have the top 25 athletes in the country all on one team. It's one of these situations, right? But they all have receiver coaches and they all have like defensive back coaches that have all these drills. And the general deal is like, look, they do a lot of chopping their feet and they do a lot of work on just the like it's like if they're going to be in press coverage the whole time. They do all this
Yeah.
crazy chop 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 before they ever go anywhere. And my take is like, look, from what I see in high school, and not everyone's running press all the time, but they're terrible at the top of their pattern. And when they actually get to release and get out off the top of their pattern, they get no separation. And that was kind of my thing was like, we spend so much time working on these little choppy steps in the beginning to try to get, a quarter inch of separation, which we can go in on that too. But they get to the top of the rep when they're at actually a decent velocity. And if they had really great foot position and body position and good timing, they would get like, 2 yards, 3 yards off of some of these things before these kids are any
Yep.
wiser and can break on them. And they just don't do it. And again, I just kind of leave it alone on my end because I'm the strength and conditioning coach. I talk to the
Hard,
head coach.
right? Yeah.
It's impossible. And again, like there are things with some of these guys they work with are legitimate All-Americans from college and played in the NFL. And this is what they teach and they think works. So I have to go like, okay, there's something about what that guy has experienced that he thinks that's the way to teach it. And so I yield to that a lot. For me on my training with the kids, when I get them on one-on-one, if I'm running a 45-degree cut or a 90-degree cut, there's not going to be a lot of stutter stepping, right? I'll
No.
teach them how to like get your foot in the ground and the angle of your body to where they feel it. They just go boop and they shoot right out of it faster than they entered the ground. And so they go, oh shit, like sorry for the French. They're like, oh man, I feel that. And they get it. And now like it's not hard to convince them once they feel it. So if you can
Yeah.
teach them like their angle like of their body compared to where their foot's at, I think a big thing, Jay, is a lot of these coaches, what they do with the stutter stepping is they end up popping really vertically and under very close or under their base of support. And we know that like if I'm going full speed, I want to make a 90-degree cut, my foot has got to be like out here
Yeah.
angle, push me back this way and in pace. And they don't get that. But I think we'll get there. It's just like when the movement science and the player feel starts to go like this, it'll get there.
Yeah. So this kid that I was talking about, this lacrosse kid, he's got a twin brother who's an even higher ranked recruit than he is, and he plays
Of course.
defense. So, but it is awesome because I have him do all these one-on-one drills. And as far as like agility stuff goes, I have gone to almost all one-on-one drills because I
Awesome.
think ultimately you have to beat somebody one-on-one if you want to create space.
Yeah.
And the stuff we do, I mean, this was a whole nother topic, but stuff we do with like 2-on-1, 2-on-2, 3-on-3. I get it. You're doing agility stuff, but it's not the sport. So to say it transfers to the sport, I would rather just someone be good at separating one on
Heads
one.
up. Yeah.
So anyway, having them do one on one drills when they first came in, the kid who plays defense was winning every single time because this kid would stutter step every time he tried to make a
Yeah.
move around him. And I would try to manipulate the spacing of the drill and where they were the end goal of the drill, where it would be close to like a 50-50. And it's funny, like every time the kid stutter stepped, the defensive player just ate him up, just easily. He didn't get fooled once. And now, like just this past Wednesday, when I had them, the kid who's the offensive player, he didn't stutter step one single time and had way more wins overall. And it just goes to the point where as soon as you stutter step, you allow the defensive player to slow down. And when they slow down, they have way more movement options.
Yeah.
If you get them committed to moving fast, it is way easier to beat them one on one because you know where you're going to go, but they don't know where you're going to go. And
Dude,
that's it.
That's so good. I mean, I made a presentation about this. It was like early COVID, and I was trying to just keep my name out there. I made a presentation called the Athletic X Factor. Athletic X Factor, from everything that I can deduce, I mean, everything that I can look at is offensive player has to be the very early decider, and they have to get the defensive player moving, right? And I took it like a different angle. I said, look, there's a 50 millisecond electromechanical delay from the reactor versus the person who's making the decision.
Yep.
All you're doing if you're an offensive player and stutter stepping your feet is cueing that person into something's about to happen, and they can either anticipate it or they can make a great jump or close you out, do whatever they need to do. Excuse me. But if the offensive player is making a move, bang, and they're an early decider, you still have that like 50 millisecond time before you go, oh shit, and then you can pop off your feet and go with them. And then my deal for defensive players was you have to stay active. You can't slow down. You have to pop, pop, pop. You have to be ready to go. So I think that's brilliant. I think you're 100% right that every scenario I've seen where the defender eats it up is because there is a tell and the offensive player is not being direct and bang, making that move. So I think, yeah, that's very cool. Very cool.
And I think people will talk about like people like Barry Sanders or even
Yeah.
like as the Eagles fan, LaShawn McCoy was so good at making people miss.
Right.
They're the exception where they can slow down enough and get you to slow down enough where they still have such a quick pop off the ground where they can gain a step instantly. But that is not always the case. To have that level of explosiveness is it's not there for a lot of people. And if you want to create the separation, you can't stutter step. You can't have the other athletes slow down as much.
It's really like the point of balance, like in football, we have these come to balance drills, right? So we're moving and then we have to come back basically into a great point of balance where our base of support is lined up. I don't think a lot of people can go through the stutter stepping and maintain their point of balance and also be reactive enough that once they see you like, oh, got him, like I can make that next step and exploit that split second that you've got to make a move. But I think you're right. I mean, honestly, I think I wasn't a great athlete, but the one note people made was like, oh, when you put your foot in the ground, you get really good separation. And kind of what I figured out as I've gotten older was I'm not really that strong. I'm strong enough, but I actually have very good feet and elasticity and like good stiffness. And that is, again, like that's the one thing that I can still demonstrate decently well. I can't dance around with these kids. If they get me in an open field scenario, I'm screwed trying to react. But I can do all these things, and it's just from practice and whatever. Like if I can learn it and I can improve and I can mess around with the kids and do fine, when these kids get it, it's not fair. When they understand that, like, oh, I don't have to make 6 steps and run my feet backwards before I run forward. It's a whole different, they're literally playing with an extra half second of time where they're like, it's not on them. It's on the other person to figure it out. And I think that is game speed. If you're talking about game scenarios and what happens, that's game speed.
Totally agree. Another awesome conversation, Ryan. Anything you're working on right now? Anything you want to plug?
Well, I have a mentorship with my business partner, Mr. Jason Lee, called the Performance Paradigm. And that's our big project. So this is our 4th group. And we're ever refining. Now we're in the beautification phase. So expect some wild graphics, but no, that's basically it. I have a gym in New York, SoHo Strength Lab. And yeah, that's just doing its thing.
I would say the best strength coach that not enough people know about.
I
You right
appreciate
there.
it. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Um, yeah. Go give him a follow on Instagram. There's always so much stuff, and I love when he posts because it always makes me think. Very intriguing.
Well, we're winning. Oh, I appreciate that.
All right. All right. Have a good one, Rye. Thank you.
Thanks, bud. Thanks, Jay.
If you enjoyed the podcast and think someone else can learn something from this, please take a few seconds right now and share it on social media. Go to multidirectionalpower.com to check out my improving game speed course as well as programs. Thanks for listening.